Prime Minister Albanese has backed the Treasurer's push to look at changing superannuation tax concessions. Suggestions of reform in this area come despite promises made before and during the election campaign that there would be no major changes to super under an Albanese government. Here's a reminder of a few of those comments.
Does Labor commit to the current super arrangements for self-funded retirees and other superannuants? And do you rule out any increases to super taxes and changes to caps?
We've said we have no intention of making any super changes. One of the things that we're doing in this campaign is we're making all of our policies clear. We're putting them out there for all to see.
Look, we said about superannuation that we would maintain the system. Australians shouldn't expect major changes to superannuation if the government changes hands.
He was the Prime Minister today when asked about the issue.
Have you broken an election promise not to change superannuation tax breaks by flagging review clamping down on super concessions?
That's a big call you've made. We haven't made any announcements at all. The long-term issue of superannuation is something that we do need to deal with. My government makes no apologies for pointing out what the future looks like in 10, 20 years' time if there isn't a debate about change. And we are engaged in that debate very clearly.
Let's bring in the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. You heard the Prime Minister there, out of his mouth. He says there's been no announcement made. They're having a debate. What's your contribution to that debate?
Well, I think Australians have been sold a pup. It's clear the Prime Minister said one thing before the election, and he's saying something quite different right now. I mean, he was unequivocal before the election. Right now, he's saying, "Oh no, we're going to look at things." I mean, look, Australians were told very clearly that Labor wasn't going to play around with superannuation. Australians want to have confidence that these very long-term investments aren't going to be played with by government. It's not the government's money; it's their money. And I think Australians have again been sold a pup. We're seeing exactly the same thing with franking credits, introduction of legislation just in the last little while, which is much broader than anything that could have been anticipated. Many thousands of objections coming in to that, and we know that the Treasurer has been talking about the stage 3 tax cuts and getting rid of those. So Labor says one thing before the election, something very different now.
One of the things that the Treasurer was keen to point out was that we're going to spend more on superannuation tax concession than the aged pension by 2050 is the date that was mentioned. Is that something that a Treasurer should canvass?
Well, he could have said all this before the election, Kieran. He could have said all of this before the election, but they chose not to. You know, it's looking more and more like this is a Trojan horse government. They won government saying one thing and they're doing something completely different. We've seen that on electricity prices. We've seen it on franking credits. We know we're already seeing ideas being floated about the stage 3 tax cuts, and now we're seeing it on superannuation. And superannuation is an area where people make very long-term investments. So governments need to be extremely cautious about making changes in this area, particularly if they've made a commitment before an election. But it seems that everything's on the cards now for Labor. Who knows where they're going to go next? The one thing I know they're not focusing on, Kieran, is that the cost of living pressures and rising interest rate pressures that are bearing down on all Australian households and businesses. And that's where they should be focusing their attention, not raising taxes.
On superannuation, do you think there's an argument, say, for a cap on a $5 million cap on super tax concessions has been a figure that's been put forward by some industry representatives? Is that something you'd be open to at a level, say, $5 million?
Well, as I said, the starting point here is Labor made a commitment before the election. People make very long-term investments in super, and so you've got to be very cautious with change in this area, and I think that's incredibly important to understand. What we're also hearing, by the way, from the government, from the Treasurer in the last few days and in his essay that he wrote over the summer, is that he wants more investment from superannuation in his pet projects. I mean, the starting point here is that this is Australians' money, not the government's money, not fund managers' money, Australians' money. Everyone's money who is listening to this and watching this today, it's their money. And it seems that Labor has always seen superannuation as their own money. That's not the right way to think about it.
Well, certainly the industry, when I've interviewed them on this program, have said that their top three priorities continue to be and are today investor return, investor return, investor return. So how they might get them to engage in those sorts of investments remains to be seen, Shadow Treasurer.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Kieran. And I mean, I think the focus has to be absolutely on the investor, on the fact that it's their money, that they have complete transparency of how that money is being invested and the fees that are being paid on it. We've had a win on that in the last couple of weeks. The unions didn't want transparency on the fees being paid, but we've seen that overturned in the Senate, which is good news. But the investor has to come first in this because it is their money. It's not Labor's. This is not for their pet projects. It's not for them to collect more tax. This is Australians' money after all.
Is there merit to having a debate about the sustainability of the super system?
Well, you know, I tell you what there's not merit in, breaking election promises, Kieran. I mean, Labor have been very, very clear before the election and now they're going in the opposite direction. I mean, this is actually about being clear with the Australian people and sticking to your promises. And if Labor wants to give up all the promises they made before the election, they should be clear about that. I mean, we've seen they've dropped their $275 reduction on electricity prices. We've seen them floating at the last budget and getting rid of the stage 3 tax cuts. We always knew that this is what Labor wanted to do, but I think it's remarkable how quickly they're just dropping all those pre-election promises. And those things really count. They are very, very important.
Do you think, though, if they took it to the next election, that would be acceptable in political terms, as opposed to, say, some shock change in the budget in May?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, if they want to take it to the next election, that's up to them. You know, at the end of the day, we had an election in 2019 where we were talking about franking credits, we were talking about negative gearing, we were talking about higher taxes, and Labor lost it. So I think they're very concerned about taking these sorts of things to an election, but they're showing much more willingness to go down this path after the election. And I think that is just simply bad government, and I think it's a breach of confidence with the Australian people.
Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.